The religion that's not a religion has to have its central design feature a significant response to the meta crisis. That top-down aspect, the socioeconomic aspect, has to be taken into account. So if this transformation that we're talking about doesn't start to restructure things, so the ecological crisis or the wealth disparities, if we're not restructuring ourselves sort of socio-historically and socioeconomically on this, then the project has failed.
I know that usually you only do one opening snippet and then get your introduction, but I'm just going to put another little one here because it is really exciting.
If we're talking about how we might have been reciprocally narrowed, right, how capitalism has done something like a reciprocal narrowing on the options in the world and the options of our agency, we shouldn't despair, because there's always the real possibility of changing the dynamical system so that it goes from reciprocal narrowing to reciprocal opening.
Hello and welcome back to the Musing Mind Podcast. We have been quiet for a few months, but things are kicking off again. I have about 7 conversations lined up over the next 2 weeks. And I'm really excited by the direction that's taking shape and the people who are going to be involved. The inquiry of the podcast is always going to be evolving to a certain degree, but it feels like it's entering this phase that I might describe as exploring the socioeconomics of subjectivity, right? So what kinds of consciousness does today's capitalism produce? And how might different economic policies or different socioeconomic visions change the subjectivity that's being produced? Much of the discourse around consciousness is about individual practices like meditation or group practices like circling and psychedelics. And this is all great for people who are able to engage in those things. But what about everybody else, right? So one of the virtues of socioeconomic policy is that it changes everybody's context in which consciousness develops, right? It alters the environment that creates the possibility landscape for our own becoming as human beings. So I have a number of conversations coming up with people who are deeply involved in economic theory and economic policy, and I want to explore what are these specific policies that should be on the table if our project is to create better conditions for the unfolding and development and exploration and play of subjectivity. But today, I get to speak with John Vervaeke. John is a professor of cognitive science at the University of Toronto, and he's becoming well known for his magnificent YouTube lecture series titled Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. He is bringing together cognitive science, and Buddhism, Western philosophy, and that perennial question of cultivating meaning in life. And he's building a vocabulary, right? A scientific framework to make better sense of religion in a post-religious age, or of human development that draws from contemplative traditions to create a richer framework for that development, more of a guiding structure or meta-narrative. The first 25 minutes or so, we set the context. We kind of establish the arena for the conversation. So we get into how there can simultaneously be what he's calling a meaning crisis and this kind of narrative of progress, right? The optimism of Steven Pinker and Max Roser, the idea that over the past few hundred years, things have been getting better and better on paper and at an exponential rate. So how can there actually be a meaning crisis, right? How can these two things coexist? And then we move into what I was really excited to speak with John about, right? Much of his work is about developing the need for an ecology of practices, or what he calls psych-technologies, that individuals or communities can use to operate on their own mechanisms of experience itself. And I wanted to ask him, what it might mean to explore economic policy as itself a form of psych-technology, right? What does it mean to think of economic policies as setting the conditions for subjectivity to become itself, to explore and develop? So we get into the structural dynamics of the meaning crisis, right? And then we get into what I think is my favorite connection made so far on this podcast, which is drawing a comparison between Mark Fisher's work on capitalist realism and the cognitive science of what John calls reciprocal narrowing, which ultimately gestures towards a cognitive science of capitalist realism. And I'll talk more about that at the end of the episode. And as always, if you find yourself enjoying the podcast, you can subscribe or rate it on iTunes or share it with a friend. These are all really helpful ways to support the project. Or if you'd like to support directly, you can always check out the Patreon page. And that is it. Please enjoy my conversation with John Vervaeke. You're taking on a lot of projects. Your YouTube series was kind of this marriage of, seemed to me, cognitive science and questions of wisdom cultivation, religion. So I wanted to ask what are the ideas and interests that have kind of cohered and brought together all of your projects? What are the questions that interest you and that have kind of led you to be exploring what it is you are now?
Oh, great. That's a fantastic question, Oshan. I mean, I really like that question. So there's a question you might say that's on the cognitive science side, but then it leads me into what you might call the existential spiritual side, or let's call that whole side the sapiential side, having to do with wisdom and meaning. Okay, so sort of the science side and the sapiential side.
Okay,
the spiritual doesn't quite capture everything I want to say about it.
Right.
Okay, so if you'll allow me that. So on the science side, the question that has just intrigued me, and I do all my sort of scientific work around it, is this question about. I think it's the question of the nature of general intelligence. It's the question of what makes you capable of being a general problem solver. What's the central capacity that's presupposed in all your special skills and more specific forms of intelligence? What's the specific capacity of your general intelligence that makes you capable of solving a wide variety of problems in a wide variety of domains in a highly competent manner, and learning and getting great skills in a specific domain? Like, how does that all? What's behind that all? And for me, I argue that that's a process that I call relevance realization. This is the issue of out of all of the information, and it's a titanic amount available to you. How do you decide what to pay attention to, what to find salient? And of course, you're not deciding. What I mean is there's some process happening in your brain so that when you walk into a room, it's automatic to you. Your salience landscape is laid out. There's patterns of obviousness as to what you should do. There's affordances for your interaction. Right. And this is what I want to pick up on the relevance realization. I'm using the word relevance realization because it has the realization term, because it has a double meaning. It means both the sense of coming into awareness, like an insight, like when, I just realized that, but also making real, coming into contact with reality. Because that situation when you come into the room, it's simultaneous you coming into something sort of analogous to an insight in which, it makes sense, but it's also how reality is, disclosing itself to you, how you're coming into contact with the world. And so you have all this information out in the world, but it's even more complicated than that. You have all this tremendous amount of information in long-term memory, and think about all the possible permutations and combinations of that. And then you have all of the possible sequences of actions you could perform. Think of all the things you could do and how you could potentially string them together. So you have this huge, combinatorial explosive set of options available to you, possible courses of action. And somehow you coordinate those three in a highly fast and highly effective fashion so that you are, right, you've got a salience landscape that's making things obvious, affording your actions. You're calling up out of all of your long-term memory the right information in the right way, and it's being reconstructed and integrated. And all of that is translating into sequences of behavior out of all of the possible courses of action in your problem space so that you actually interact effectively, intelligently, with multiple kinds of environments that are themselves dynamic and shifting. And that, to me, that's the key scientific question I'm interested in. I want to know how you do that. Now, it turns out well, at least, sorry, I shouldn't be so bold. I argue, based on, I think, good convergent theoretical argumentation and evidence, that if we start to understand that process of intelligence and relevance realization, and then how it gives rise to salience landscaping and that sort of perspectival knowing that I was talking about, you know what it's like to be in the room here now, right? Which is not the same thing as having a skill or a theory. It's that sort of here now presence. It's the kind of thing they're trying to get in good video games, that sense of presence, right? So that perspectival knowing, right? Probably also will tell us something very important about what consciousness is doing and why altered states of consciousness can have an impact on our problem solving, right? So topics like insight that bridge between sort of intelligence and consciousness. Because think about how in insight, you get a sudden shift, a self-organized shift in your capacity to solve problems, but you also get this change. That's what we describe it, like a flash of insight, right? Right? And how that relates to things like the flow state and mystical experience. And so now you see what's happening. As I start to get into this scientifically, right, I start to make connections, I think very readily, to these topics of insight, flow, wisdom, and related issues like self-deception and how that salience landscaping can bias us in ways we're not aware of. And then this all, I think, points to the deeper connection that this relevance realization, it's a way in which we think about that sense of presence. It's a way in which you're present in your body, present to the world, the way the world is present to you, the way you can be present or fail to be present with other people. You can lose touch with yourself, right? You can lose touch. And I think our sense of meaning in life is about this sense of connectedness. So the relevance realization, right, is doing this important functions of making a problem solver. But it's also, and I think for evolutionary reasons, it's feeding back into a motivational drive to do everything we can to enhance and enrich this connectedness because it's so central to our intelligence and our consciousness. But of course, right, that reward of meaning in life serves as sort of a motivational vector and force for the more sapiential things we were talking about, the insight, the flow, the sense of at-one-ment, the cultivation of wisdom, etc. So that's what sort of how it all works for me. I hope that made sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, a couple of places. One just quick response when you're talking about altered states of consciousness and the insights and the way in which those kind of feed back. A lot of the emphasis I've seen on your work, which I love, is not on any particular content of what you realize when you have an insight or what you learn. It's about how this shifts your perceptual mechanism or framework in the beginning, so that when you come back, the whole architecture operates differently. I really like that kind of processual view of things.
Well, thank you. I mean, there's two deep inspirations for that, so I want to give credit. One is a thing that Arthur Dykman, who is one of the premiers, right? He said it's ultimately not about altered states of consciousness. It's ultimately about altered traits of character.
Right.
And I think, that so that's one motivation. The other is Stanovich, who argued one of the foundational features of rationality is people coming to value the processes of their cognition rather than fixating on the products of their cognition.
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny. I was going to, in the beginning, you were talking about problem solving, and I wanted to, almost half kidding, half serious, I wanted to ask if so much of this is resting on the idea of problem solving and improving our capacity to do so. The kind of funny question would be, well, what if there was no problem? But then you, I think you answered it beautifully, which is the very fact of existing as we are with the perceptual processes that we have going. The problem is that we are always outmatched by the totality of information and possibilities, that we're always operating from this sliver. And so the problem is created with the kind of scarcity of what we have at our fingertips and what is all out there at once, whether unconsciously, right? Because like you talked about, there's a process occurring that I'm not aware of where my architecture is choosing what to make salient to me and what not. Excellent. I think that's pretty interesting.
No, I think that's fantastic. I think that's beautifully said, that our particular personal problems are ultimately grounded in existential problems of what Cherniak called, we're in the finitary predicament. We always have limited time, limited resources, limited energy, right? To try and deal with the fact that reality, in the ways I described, is combinatorially explosive for us. And so that ultimately our personal problems are constrained by and deeply motivated by sort of an existential problem, the very fact of our being. And you know, as soon as you start talking this way, you start sounding like an existentialist philosopher, right? And you start sounding like, you know, a Buddhist sage or something. Where you're talking about, you know, you have to understand the finitude and how that's an existential issue for you that constrains all of the personal problems, right, that you're focally aware of. But I think it's just now something that's becoming, I think you can make a really powerful convergence argument that this issue is one of the central issues that we need to explain in order to explain not only our cognition, but as you said, sort of, you know, our existential status.
Yeah, so much. When I've been listening to, you know, a number of conversations you've been having, and one of the things that's really stuck out to me is moments when you talk about having met and spoken with people like Shinzen Young, some longtime contemplatives. And so a lot of what your project seems to be doing is making legible these, I don't know what to call it, ideas, these processes, these practices that have existed for thousands of years. You're taking that into the language, into the vocabulary of cognitive science. And on one hand, you're showing we need to expand the field in order to really kind of welcome and make space for this. But that's what you're doing is you're meeting with these people and they're saying, yes, that's a good way to put it, right? You're bringing it into this cognitive science language.
Thank you for saying that, because first of all, that was, I mean, my goal as a cognitive science is to actually afford that kind of reciprocal reconstruction between disciplines. That's what I do as a cognitive scientist. And then what I call that process synoptic integration. And then, as you said, trying to do that sort of between cognitive science and these sapiential, you know, people and traditions and communities. The fact that I can reinforce what you're saying. Many people, one of the most prevalent responses and comments I get is exactly what you're pointing to, is that I give people a vocabulary, a conceptual vocabulary, and a theoretical grammar for articulating things, and that allows a kind of discourse and discussion and reflection on these matters. It affords it in a way that wasn't available before. And so what I want to say very clearly about that, because I think that's an excellent observation on your part, so thank you for that, is I want to say that above and beyond the particular theoretical theses I'm arguing for, and the particular, kind of arguments I'm making, the goal that has priority over that is exactly what you just said, affording that kind of reciprocal reconstruction. That's why I spend a lot of time, talking to people who are trying to build communities of practices, and getting involved with that in some deep ways. I'm doing that with Rebel Wisdom or with Raven Kelly, people like that.
Yeah. So maybe taking a step forward towards more into the terrain of what you're calling the meaning crisis, or what is often being called the meaning crisis. One way I wanted to bring that in and set a little context for it, I wanted to bring in a quote that I got from the book you'd written or co-written, Zombies in the 21st Century.
Yeah,
and
I wrote
then
that. I wrote that with Christopher Mastropietro and Philip Misovec. Yeah,
absolutely. And you folks took the zombie as a kind of metaphor for this meaning crisis, which was fantastic. Yeah. But so the quote, I'll give it a little context after. The quote is from a gentleman named Brian Walsh, who I believe was the chaplain actually at University of Toronto at one point.
Yeah, I met him. I met him on the GO train, which is how I came into. I actually literally met him in person by accident, which is how I became familiar with his work.
Oh, that's awesome! Very serendipitous. So he wrote. I'll quote him here. He wrote, "Humans are animals who most fundamentally understand what reality is, who we are, and how we ought to live by locating ourselves within larger narratives and meta-narratives that we hear and tell, that constitute for us what is real and significant. When such narratives collapse, we are lost in the dislocation, fragmentation, and disorientation of homelessness. In short, one suffers from a worldview crisis. One runs the risk of losing the plot." And so this is one way that I think we can definitely approach what the meaning crisis is.
Yes.
And I want to juxtapose that, because I think holding these two is really interesting. I want to juxtapose that with this other narrative that has also been emerging, which I don't know what we might call it, maybe the Enlightenment style narrative of progress. And this is coming from folks like Steven Pinker, Max Roser. And if folks aren't familiar, just the idea that if you look at the past 200-300 years, by most statistical measures that they are presenting, things are getting much better, and they're increasingly getting better, and so on and so forth. It's a very optimistic look. Infant mortality rates, literacy rates, sanitation, and so on. So I want to, one of the ways that I understand the meaning crisis, or one of the ways I see it, is it's this kind of like white cap that is bursting and through, and it's rupturing this otherwise kind of narrative of progress, and not necessarily dismantling it. That might, we can debate that, but I think it's pointing to a blind spot in that narrative. I've always felt that narrative of things are going well and we should feel good about it is missing something. And I think a lot of people are trying to figure out how to point to it. And so the meaning crisis and the metaphor of a zombie to me is showing that we are systematically neglecting the interiority, right? That felt sense of living. Take the zombie, for example, right? You can, from the outside, maybe not how they're usually depicted, but a zombie can look totally normal. From the outside, everything is great, but on the inside, not so much. So I wanted to ask you to talk about the meaning crisis, especially as it juxtaposes with this other narrative, right? How do these two coexist?
Yeah, I think that's excellent. So a good way to start is to make a distinction that's becoming more important in the literature between subjective well-being and meaning in life. Okay, so let's start there, because I think one of the ways of juxtaposing them is to say we must distinguish between them and not equivocate between them. Because then we're falling into a kind of deep confusion. Okay, so subjective well-being is, well, the sense like, I sort of feel good. I'm sort of things are going well. I'm kind of healthy. I'm sort of happy in this sense, not of, not in a meaning sense, but in sort of a hedonic sense that, I feel good, right? I feel good, right? That kind of thing.
Right.
And let's be clear. Because I don't want people misinterpreting me. That matters. That's important. Okay. If you don't have that, you will be highly motivated to do stuff to try to get it. Okay.
Right.
And so now, what do we know about that? Well, we know that a lot of the factors that the Enlightenment has worked on initially have a huge impact on subjective well-being. Right. So, for example, if you're in poverty, your subjective well-being is like really bad. And if you can lift people out of poverty, it has a huge impact. But what that same research shows is once people are out of poverty, you get into irrationality. Here's why. Because I have to do huge increases in wealth to bring about minor changes in subjective well-being.
Right.
Okay?
Money might not buy happiness, but poverty buys misery.
Exactly. And so, same thing with other factors. I don't want to canvass them all because for reasons of time, but that's a clear example of what I'm talking about. So first of all, the Enlightenment is right to focus on subjective well-being. And so you want, sort of stable political government. You want to get, and all the things that go towards lifting people out of poverty, improving their health, removing sort of violence in their surroundings. And the Enlightenment, and people like Pinker are exactly right. That does make human lives better in a way that kind of universally matters to human being, but not in a linear fashion. Right. So that's the first point I'm making. After a certain point, it becomes irrational to pursue them because the return on investment, the diminishing returns, like the return on investment goes down really dramatically. So there's that issue. Right. And so part of what's going on is, I think, and only one part is people are sensing, we're working harder and there's sort of more stuff. Right. And yet, it's not translating into significant increases, right, in my subjective well-being. So that's one point. The second is the distinction I made. So I want to give you an example of a clear example of where subjective well-being and meaning in life come apart. And then I'll explain what it is. And here's one that's quite universal, and this is having a child. Okay, if you want to have anything that will really crush your subjective well-being, because you're not sleeping, you're not eating properly, you're not, right? You're getting sick more often. Your relationships are being challenged. Your relationship with your partner usually becomes more conflicted. Your finances are harmed. Your freedom is diminished. Your social network, right, is frayed, and you're going to actually lose years off your life.
Right.
Why do people do it? Because although all of that goes down reliably, you know what goes up? Meaning in life.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm trying to give you a clear case, right, of how these two are not to be identified with each other.
Right.
So what is it that people are getting with the child that aren't these factors that go into, right, subjective well-being? So, well, think about it. It's this kind of connectedness we were talking about earlier. Let me give you a clear example. One of the things having a child does. So one of the things that is going to come to you if you're in that project is you're going to get one of the most significant challenges to your egocentrism that you've ever had.
Mm-hmm.
Because you can't be the center anymore. The child has to be the center, right? And so there's this orientation of a connectedness to something other than myself that has a value independent of my egocentric desires, right? There's a connection to something bigger than myself, if you allow me to speak metaphorically. That, and Susan Wolf has argued this is one of the most significant contributors, this sense of mattering to something other than yourself, outside of your egocentric desires and goals. That is significantly constitutive of meaning in life, right?
Mm-hmm.
And also what's happening here? Well, you have to go through a process of self-transcendence, self-transformation. There's a kind of developmental connectedness to yourself. We use the metaphor of growth for that. You feel that you're growing as a person because you have a connection to yourself that is affording a kind, you're not just learning more, you're becoming a new kind of person with a new sets of values, a new connection to yourself in the world. So that there's that growth, that connected to yourself. There's the mattering to other people. There's being caught up agapically, loving something in a creative fashion, not to consume it or not to enter into reciprocity yet. You don't love a child for those reasons. You love a child because you're trying to transform something into a person, a fully fledged, morally statist person, right? And functioning person. And so there's also the sense of being involved in a long-term narrative, right? That gives you a sense of how to prioritize your goals. So there's that kind of sense of connectedness to your future that we capture with the term purpose.
Right.
Right. And then finally, right, what we're also looking for, and this doesn't actually contradict what I said about the egocentrism, but it's still there. We also want to be in attachment relationships. I don't mean attachment in the Buddhist sense. I mean in the psychological sense. We want to be involved in relationships in which, human development and person making is really important. And we want to be in those because we not only want to care, we want to be cared for. And typically when we have a child, right, we get enmeshed into a community of some kind as well. So what I'm trying to show you is all the things that, right, that are sort of, and this is what the research is showing, are needed for meaning in life that are not going to be addressed if you are trying to just increase the measures for subjective well-being. So I think this is the two ways in which the Enlightenment thinkers are missing it. First of all, although I agree with them, and they're right, and Pinker's graphs, for all of their controversy, I think do point to the fact that the Enlightenment has reliably increased subjective well-being. But again, the first mistake is there was the presumption that that was a linear relationship, a linear correlation, and it's not. And the second deeper mistake is to think that subjective well-being is sufficient for meaning in life, and it's not. So I think what people are missing is because of the first mistake, they're sort of getting a sense of there's something more. And very often, and we can talk about this in a few minutes, there's symptoms that the society is not particularly affording or hospitable to cultivating, these connections of meaning in life. And so, so there, the graphs that Pinker doesn't put on very much or talk very much. You're getting these increases, even in places of significant affluence like Silicon Valley, of mental health issues, of reports of loneliness, of people engaging in the virtual exodus, preferring the virtual world, because the virtual world has a narrative. It has a clear set of rules for how you can self-transcend, right? It gives you all these things where it makes you the hero, so you can matter to things beyond you, right? That's why people love the virtual world, these games, because they have the missing meaning and life features that they're not finding in their real life. Or you find, the addiction crises that we're going through. So you have all these markers that are symptomatic of the fact that although in many ways, we have created a world in which subjective well-being is more realizable. We're also we're getting clear evidence that there's a really important missing piece. And the thing about this is, if meaning in life is left unaddressed, it's very destructive of people. It can even be fatal.
Right. Yeah. Not to jump too far ahead here, but a lot of this Enlightenment style work has been predicated upon the kind of final end of subjective well-being. And that you're saying that is not sufficient. That doesn't quite go far enough. And relating this back to Brian Walsh's idea of we've lost the plot, one of the outcomes, or one of the elements that I'm getting a lot from your series that you've done a lot of work on, is talking about what would it mean to establish what I think is being loosely called a religion of no religion. And
or a religion that's not a religion. I keep moving between the two titles because neither one is accurate. And so, please continue.
Yeah. And that's it. Even despite the perils of trying to put a label to that and what that means and what it invokes, the need is that it's pointing to our lack of a meta-narrative to kind of orient everything else, to give this sense of purpose, this kind of narrativity or idea of progression towards something beyond just that subjective well-being component. One of the ways I spoke previously with a guy named Zach Stein, and
I know Zach. He's a great guy. Yeah, it's important work. He needs to be more well known.
I agree. He talks about what he calls the meta crisis, this convergence of a number of crises, civilizational scale crises, as ultimately a crisis of human development, right? Yeah. Which I think is pointing to the same idea that we're not going far enough, that we've lost the plot that's kind of guiding progression. One of the ways that I've been thinking about your work and what a religion that is not a religion means and why it has a role in the discourse still is it's trying to show that despite whatever relativity, whatever contexts we create for ourselves, something that is wisdom exists beyond those relative contexts. There's something that transcends that, right? And what the meta-narrative does is it threads through all of the different contexts, all the diversity, that we cultivate in the 21st century. It's maintaining the shared idea about what wisdom is and the process of its cultivation to kind of extend that notion of human development beyond where we might say it is kind of come to a rest, right? One of the ways that you've talked about, that you've spoken about this is, this was from your book again, where you wrote that the universe went from being a beautiful, living cosmos unfolding a great story to a lifeless series of random collisions signifying nothing, right? So again, we've lost the plot. And carrying from that, you then wrote, this is one of my favorites, there's a deep dissatisfaction with everyday existence and a disquieting horror of its perceived inescapability. And so that wall at the end where we perceive the inescapability, where we feel paralyzed, where we feel stuck, that's where I see this religion that is not a religion functioning, right? Is a participatory transforming that response, right? And so and that's the question. So what does it mean to transform that dissatisfaction, to extend the notion of human development beyond, where it has not gone far enough? And this is where I think you get into practices and so on. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. Wow, that's a really excellent way of formulating this issue and turning it into a question. Wow, that's really good. I think Thomas Bjorkman actually came up with the sort of the original idea of the meta crisis, and then Zach, of course, has done some excellent work on it. I just wanted to mention that because I think Thomas's work is also something that people should pay more attention to. Because the reason why that's particularly relevant is he also sees it as a question of how do we afford the development that is missing and needed. So let's try and do this step by step, if you'll allow me, because I can't give you like a 2-minute answer to that question.
Right.
We might have to do a bit of dialogue. So let's pick up first on what this religion of not a religion is, and I point to the ongoing work, with Jordan Hall that I'm doing, and the work, the partnership with him is really integral to developing this. And we're going to be meeting again today. We've had two meetings on this. One we've published as a video. Another one was private. We'll probably start publishing some other ones. But
nice.
Let's go step by step. First of all, what am I picking up on? Remember this sense of connectedness I've been talking about, right?
Yeah.
One of the possible, and I think it's many people consider it a highly plausible etymological origins of the word religion is the word religio. But what religio means to bind together, to connect, right? And although I think you're right to talk about how Brian invoked the notion of plot, but Brian actually also invokes in the quote you read the notion of losing a sense of being at home, right? And why I say that is because the term that he uses is the term domicide, which is the loss of the sense of being at home. When you feel at home, right, you feel, again, that sense of connectedness to yourself, to your world, to other people. That's why you like being at home. That's why you find home potentially meaningful. And that's why when you lose home, and remember, you can lose home both physically and also just psychologically, right? We've all been in places where we have a dwelling, but it's not our home. That sense of domicide, here's a way of thinking about it. Domicide is a sense of being culture shocked, but within your own culture. Right? So that the sense of being at home, that deep participatory knowing, that sort of mutual shaping and fittedness between you and the world. And Chris and Philip and I talk about that as this agent arena relationship. That is what is being sort of deeply frayed. Now, what we need, as you said, is not more theory, because if what I just said is right, then the problem isn't at the level of our propositions and the belief. The problem is at these deeper levels of the processes of our connectedness, many of which, right, are presupposed by our capacity for theorizing and argumentation. This is what sort of a lot of phenomenology and what's called 4E cognitive science, I think, is arguing. So we, as you say, we need practices, but they have to be, if you'll allow me a metaphor, they have to be deep practices. They have to reach deeply into that existential problem we were talking about earlier. Now, the idea is that this is basically a problem of religio, a problem of getting these deep connections to work so that we feel, in an existential sense at home. So we're not suffering domicide within our culture and within our environment and the thing that binds those two together within our worldview. And what we argue in the book is we are actually suffering disconnection in all of those, right? In a profound way. We're suffering, like I say, this sort of domicide culture shock within our own culture. So we need practices that recover, and I want to hyphenate this word. We need to recognize, right? We need to recognize, reactivate, reappreciate religio so that we can accentuate it, so that we can bring back, right, the enhancement of this connectedness that's being lost. Now, the things that the way you do that, right, because human beings are very complex. These very complex, self-organizing, autopoietic dynamical systems. The way you intervene in them, you can't just do one-shot interventions. You have to have a complex ecology of practices. That's why you get things like the Eightfold Path. We have all these things that have to be cultivated in a mutually reinforcing fashion. You sort of have to create a dynamical system that can couple to the dynamical system that's you. That's why I say you have to create this ecology of practices that can sort of dynamically couple to you as a dynamical system to bring about this deep kind of transformation. And the things that have done that for us in the past, right, is religion. And religion did that, and it did something else, which is something you also put your finger on, which is, as you said, this sort of universal aspect of wisdom. when you take a look at that machinery we were talking about earlier, that adaptive machinery of intelligence and consciousness, and I make an argument for that, it's extended argument throughout the series. The very machinery that makes you adaptive is the same machinery that makes you prone to self-deception. Mm-hmm. And so, right, what cultures need perennially, right, across time and history, is they need ecologies of practice that not only enhance religio, but enhance religio while also ameliorating self-deception. And that's, when you put those two together, that to me is what I'm meaning by wisdom. Mm-hmm. And so we need ecologies of practice that help us reliably and systematically overcome the self-deception, all the bullshit that we are overwhelmed with. And this is a way in which people also talk about the meaning crisis, a sense that there's just more and more bullshit everywhere.
Right.
We need to be able to reliably and systematically cut through that, both individually and collectively. And we need that to be, integrated with, we need the ecology of practice to also have the integrated goal of affording enhanced religio. And religions have done that. So for all of the, I think, legitimate reasons why we criticize them, they are nevertheless our best template. Now, here's why the religion that's not a religion, okay? I would argue that one of the significant factors for domicide for many people is that the established religions that used to do this so well, and I give in the series convergent argument from many other thinkers like Tillich and Heidegger's. Mm-hmm. So this is not just my argument, right? But one of the reasons one of the reasons we argued in the book, and Chris and I are writing another book right now, is that most, I would say all, maybe, is that too bold? Gee, I'm worried about hubris here. Okay, all of the ways of wisdom, both sort of philosophical and religious, and they overlap in tremendous degrees, right? It's only recently that we pulled those two apart. All of them were born out of the axial revolution, and all of them are bound up with the two worlds mythology of the axial revolution, that we're sort of in this everyday world that is somehow decayed or fallen or illusory or not real, and we have to somehow get to the real world, the heaven world, the transcend, and wisdom is about this self-transcendence, and you have this picture of reality that therefore that homes your pursuit of wisdom. It says, oh yes, this is why you pursue wisdom, because the world is structured this way. And this is right. You need to make this leap. You need to ascend, right? And you need to bridge between heaven and earth, and you need to reconcile God and man, all of this language. The problem is, so the psycho-technologies are bound up in a mythos. I don't use myth because we've made that term a pejorative term,
right?
But it's bound up in all of this mythos of the two worlds mythology that has been consistently, right, and increasingly undermined by things like, the Protestant Reformation, the scientific revolution, the Industrial Revolution, the secularization of the political domain and the economic domains, the secularization of our healthcare, of our education. All of these things have conspired to undermine that two-world mythology. So for many people, they cannot feel at home in the religions. Now, our culture is misframing this as a problem of, I can't believe it. That's not the central issue. That's not the central issue. And arguing about trying to change people's beliefs, I would argue, is missing and misframing the real problem. The real problem is people can't feel at home in these religions. Most of the people that are nuns, N-O-N-E-S, and they're a growing group, right? They are not what you would call sort of standard Enlightenment atheists. Many of them do all kinds of weird, eclectic, sets of spiritual practices, right? Because they have that hunger. But the traditional religions, right? They don't feel at home in them. Right. And they're well aware that the purported secular alternatives, the pseudo-religious ideologies of Nazism and fascism and communism, etc., have drenched the world in blood. So that's not an option. So they realize, right, they need something that's not a religion, right? But they don't want the secular alternative, so they also need it to be something like a religion. That's why I'm putting a name on a problem. It's that you say it's a contradiction, but it's because there's a tension there. We need something that's not a religion, but it's also not the secular alternative. It needs to be a religion that's not a religion. And that's the problem of trying to create, right? Try to somehow get a dynamic system, an ecology of practices that affords wisdom and self-transcendence, but that no longer is trying to home itself within the two worlds mythos or within political ideologies. That's the issue. That's the issue, I think.
Yeah. And where I jump off here, where I really want to participate in a particular element of this discourse, which is when we get into the ecologies of practice and exploring these various psychotechnologies. I actually think that this has been flourishing over the past few years, and recently it feels to be exponentially increasing.
It is.
Exactly.
It is, totally. Yeah.
Which is great. It's heartening. It's exciting. It's what a time to be alive, right? But where I'm interested, and I don't know if this is just because I have a background in economics, I'm interested in how do we take this same motivation, and rather than asking, what can I do? And in an individual sense, what can we do as a small community, whether it's the monastic academy trying to form new literal communities of practice and revive the monastic tradition? What are the structural kind of parallels to this conversation, right? So one of the phrases I've been playing with is, what would it mean if we think of certain socioeconomic policies as themselves forms of psychotechnologies? And the way that I think about that.
Yeah. Good. Keep going. That's really exciting. Keep going.
Yeah. The way that I think about that, especially differentiating between policy and, for lack of a better term, the individual will, is these kind of, like you mentioned healthcare. Universal healthcare is going to redesign the context in which we become, in which we take up various practices, right?
It does, for sure.
Yeah. One of the thinkers who I've been drawing a lot here is Peter Sloterdijk, the German philosopher. And his thing that he hammered into my brain is that everything we do is a practice, right? Practice is built of repetitions. And he frames life as what he called an operatively curved space, where everything always feeds back on to participate in our process of becoming. So I'm thinking about economic frameworks as ways to not necessarily redesign, but how do we nudge the framework of society, the sociocultural institutions that create the possibility landscape? Because I think, to use your terminology a little bit, the salience landscape changes in accord or in relationship with those kinds of structural dynamics. And there's always going to be, what does it take to be somebody who is not only has the means to meditate twice a day, to participate in whatever is happening, but also just the luck of being a human being. There's some people, there's always a degree of, and I want to use this loosely, a degree of privilege, or a degree of, you are lucky that you have the machinery to do this. And so what I'm thinking about is, how do we extend beyond, the small groups? And to me, that gets into economic policy.
I think, sort of socio-political economic policy,
right?
Because trying to, I don't have the training you do. I just did a couple undergrad courses in sort of economics, but I was sort of convinced that and my supervisor was actually a philosophical critic of classical economics. So that's sort of where I come from. I think, first of all, I think what you just said was brilliant. I think that's fantastic. I do want to point out what I've just said, which is I'm hesitant to comment on areas where I don't have the requisite expertise.
Right.
Okay. So in other areas, I'm very confident because I've done research, I ran experiments, I've debated issues. I've done a lot of the science, right? So I feel, and a lot of the philosophy and the history, I've done those. So I am going to be much more hesitant and tentative here, because I do not want to speak beyond the scope of my limited expertise. Mm-hmm. What I can do, first of all, is to acknowledge, I think, the legitimacy and the truth of what you're saying. I think another thing, and this is what Jordan Hall and I are talking about, I think one of the design features, let me just say something about this. When Jordan and I are talking about design features, people have sometimes thought, well, they're trying to design the religion that's not a religion. And how ridiculous and hubristic is that? That's not what we mean by a design feature. I want to pick up on what you just said. this is already happening. All these communities, these emerging, ecologies and practices, and the attempt through the new medium, the social media, right, to create
Right.
networks and an emerging culture, even all of that is already happening. When we're talking about design features, we're trying to, do what we talked about at the very beginning of this, Oshan. Can we bring a conceptual vocabulary and a theoretical grammar to this that
Right.
can, really, really help afford and facilitate its development in the direction we want to go? And here's the design feature. The religion that's not a religion has to have its central design feature, right?
Mm-hmm.
The significant response, a significant response to the meta crisis. So that is why what you said, right? And that's a lot, because that, again, is like you said, it's going to take transformation at the individual level, the communitary level, and then, as you said, sort of the social structural level. And I totally agree with that. So this is just a way of saying that top-down aspect, the socioeconomic aspect, has to be taken into account. So if if this transformation that we're talking about doesn't start to restructure things, so the ecological crisis or the wealth disparities, or because it's going to come back, an energy crisis, all of these, if we're not restructuring ourselves sort of socio-historically and socio-economically on this, then the project has failed. That's what I mean. It's a very stringent, strong condition. The other religions had sort of their non-negotiable goals, like getting to heaven or achieving nirvana, right?
Right.
This is the thing that has to be made central. So that is what I can talk about with sort of confidence, and I can also say I see what you're saying. Now, as to what that means, like Jordan and I have talked about some ideas about different patterns of social organization. And one thing I can talk about here, because this is also where I do have some expertise, is how distributed cognition works. Distributed cognition is the locus of collective intelligence. It's what we do by networking brains together, the way the internet networks computers together. So the internet can do things that no individual computer can do. Distributed cognition has a kind of collective intelligence that can solve problems that individuals can't do. And what we can look at is what are the good networks for getting distributed cognition going? And one of the things that has seemed obvious to us is, and I take this almost to be like a cognitive cultural grammar for us, is the idea, the way you solve, the way you structure distributed cognition is sort of Iron Age hierarchies, right? It turns out that that's actually not the best way to structure distributed cognition for solving problems. And if what we're doing is structuring, right, social structures, distributed cognition, to solve the hornet's nets of problems that we're calling the meta crisis, then we should be trying to get the best organization we can of distributed cognition for problem solving. And it looks like you don't want a hierarchical organization. You want what's called a small network, a dynamically reconstructing small network structure,
Right.
The kind of structure the internet has. And also, by the way, I would argue that's also how the brain is organized. That's how you get all these individual neurons, and there's a lot of them with a lot of connections to be well organized in a constantly dynamic fashion so that they become good at problem solving. And so we should be we should try to break the grammar. And this is really transgressive. I know it's almost Gnostic. We need to be breaking the grammar of the hierarchy, which is also wedded to the two worlds mythology. Because the one way in which people reinterpreted hierarchies in the actual revolution, because hierarchies exist before, right? But they reinterpreted the hierarchy as the ladder, the pyramid between, right, the two worlds. And we need to break out of this hierarchical way. Like obviously, we're not going to get rid of all hierarchies. That would be a ridiculous prescription.
Right.
What I'm saying is, let's not make it the only structure we consider. We need to consider dynamical small world network formations, social structuring, if we want to organize people to solve the meta crisis, and it's already implicitly there. Your brain works this way. Small groups set up as small world networks. So the scientists running the rovers on Mars, they organize themselves as a dynamically reconstructing small world network, not as a hierarchy to solve the very difficult problems of managing things long distance on Mars. The internet is set up like a small world network, a very dynamically reconstructive one. So I'm not prescribing something that's, like unicorns or pixies. It's already reliably in place. So we should be paying more careful attention to that.
Well, that's exactly one of the ways that I think about the policies. So I'm interested in, I look a lot at universal healthcare. I look a lot at things like universal basic income or international tax policy. And one of the heuristics I use to make sense of what am I looking for, what are the design features that we should be keeping in mind, I think about it in terms of how can we afford the optimal or even maximal self-organizing capacity. What's the minimum amount of centralized governance that affords the maximum amount of bottom-up organization, right?
Yeah, that's beautiful.
And I had a feeling that you would follow in the tradition of academics, which is knowing when they shouldn't comment on something. I had a feeling you would mention that wasn't your expertise. So what I did, I want to try to draw a parallel between something you've done a lot of cognitive scientific work on, and work in kind of the socioeconomic, the sociology of it all.
Please do.
Can
I say one thing? Because I want to point out that would be another. These two are interlocked in my mind, and I should have been more explicit. But I think you put your finger on it, and you foregrounded it and explicated it in a way that should be flagged with salience. This idea of giving priority to the self-organization, self-correcting, dynamic aspects, which means these systems will periodically go through potentially criticality, and we have to sort of take that into account. I think that's also something. So if we talk about sort of wiring as a small world network, we should think about it sort of firing. I'm using a brain analogy here, in a self-organizing, highly self-organizing, self-correcting fashion. I think that's something also. So instead of pursuing stability, right, which is maybe also what, that's a maladaptive holdover from Iron Age hierarchies, we should be pursuing self-correction. Yeah. I think part of what's degenerated in our political discourse is we've lost the idea of democracy as a process of self-correction, and that we should ultimately have allegiance to the self-correction as to our particular positions. Yes. I think that, so I just wanted to say that I think those two are deeply intermeshed, the small world network and the self-correcting, the dynamic self-organization that you pointed to. I just wanted to really flag that.
Absolutely. Yeah, I agree. All right. So the idea I want to draw out, are you familiar at all with the work of Mark Fisher?
I've heard the name, but no. People keep recommending his work too.
Yeah, so he, I don't know how to describe him, but he wrote a book called Capitalist Realism, and it's very much on the subjectivity of capitalism. And one of the main themes he drew out in that was he was building on Frederick Jameson's kind of infamous quip at this point that it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. And what Fisher expands on is he explores the way in which one of the products that capitalism produces is a particular type or orientation of subjectivity in which it becomes increasingly difficult to imagine an alternative. So his thesis is that capitalism makes it so that we cannot imagine any alternative. We are stuck at the end of economic history, so on and so forth. And what I wanted to explore if it's possible, is if we can link this to some work that you have done on reciprocal narrowing.
Yes. I was just going to say that. Exactly. Oh, wow. What an excellent connection. And that also goes towards the whole idea that we are always working within a cultural cognitive grammar. Exactly.
And I'll turn this over to you to kind of flesh it out. But so you brought this up in terms of addiction, and I'll do a poor man's job, and you can round it out where what occurs in reciprocal narrowing, or at least in addiction, right? The old paradigm thought was that it's a biochemical imbalance, and that's not far enough down on the chain of causality. That what occurs is a process, and to use your word, a participatory process in which the possibilities available to us in life. Let's say I'm an addict. As I engage with, let's say it's booze is my thing. As I engage with booze, it becomes increasingly difficult to imagine doing anything other than increasing with booze. And as that goes on, my behaviors narrow and narrow and narrow. And so Fisher's, if we want to draw that out, Fisher's point is that by engaging with the machinery of capitalism, our capacity to imagine alternatives gets smaller and smaller and smaller and narrows. So I wonder if we can draw any parallels between them.
I want to explore this with you. I think this is a fantastic proposal. Wow. I'm really enjoying this conversation.
Me too.
So this is I think this is a brilliant idea of my colleague and good friend, the neuroscientist Mark Lewis, who I think is one of the premier experts on addiction. And he sort of challenges the disease model of addiction. There's sort of this foreign thing inside you that's sort of twisting your health and compelling you to act in a certain way. I want to be clear about neither Mark nor I, we're not saying that there isn't a biochemical aspect to addiction. That's a ridiculous claim. What we're saying is that's massively insufficient. The disease model that basically claims that's a sufficient explanation of the behavior of addiction, that's what's being challenged. So Mark replaces a disease model with a learning model. But as you said, it's a participatory kind of learning. And the idea, let's take your booze example. So I drink some booze and I'm drunk. And so I lose a lot of cognitive machinery. My problem solving abilities degrade, right? Of course they do. Right. Now that I do it because it's alleviating some stressors, but I pay a price for that. My cognitive flexibility, my problem solving degrades. Now, as I lose cognitive flexibility, the options, my relevance realization machinery gets screwed, and the options in the world that become available to me, I lose some of those options, and that narrows the world. Now, as I start to see the world as more narrowed, as having fewer options, I start to lose cognitive flexibility because I start to go into kind of a scarcity mentality. I'm losing options. And when people go into scarcity, they start to lose cognitive flexibility. They start to become more short-termed in their thinking. So I start to lose more of my cognitive agency. And then as I lose more of my cognitive agency, the world options shrink, until eventually I shrink so much and the world shrinks so much, I can't see any other world possible than the one I'm in, and I can't see any other self than what I am. And that's to be the addict. And so does that help bringing that up?
Absolutely.
That's the reciprocal narrowing. Now, first of all, before we lose it, I want to point something out, because I got to do this in person with Mark when we were at lunch. I said, Mark, I get this is brilliant, the reciprocal narrowing. But if reciprocal narrowing is a thing, then reciprocal opening is a thing.
Yes, the opposite direction. Yeah.
Yeah, and I've tried to argue in the series that I think Plato gave a model for that in the notion of anagoge. And Mark went, "Oh yes, that has to be the case." And so what we want to say first of all, so we could sort of keep this as a meta thing to keep in mind. If we're talking about how we might have been reciprocally narrowed, right? How capitalism has done something like a reciprocal narrowing on the options in the world and the options of our agency, so that we come to something that is deeply analogous to the addict. We shouldn't despair, because there's always the real possibility of, changing the dynamical system so that it goes from reciprocal narrowing to reciprocal opening, which means we don't. The reason I'm saying that, and this is kind of important, I think, Oshan, because I want to break out of the apocalyptic revolution as the way we break out of reciprocal narrowing. Well, no, we might not. In fact, revolution might be just too much criticality. What we in fact probably need is a process of reciprocal opening.
Yes.
So I want to, again, I'm trying to break out of both the left and right ways, which I think are now becoming increasingly unhelpful, of trying to address this issue, right?
Yeah. You mentioned the term scarcity, and I know you've done some work on specifically what you've called meaning scarcity, and I thought that it's really relevant, and the way you framed it, you kind of touched on it just now, is that when we feel a scarcity of meaning, when we don't see avenues to generate and participate in these more meaningful ways of living, we cling to the slender sources that we currently have. And I think this is also at play when we think about socioeconomic evolution, that the more difficult it becomes to realistically entertain alternatives, the more we are driven to cling to what we have already. Right.
That's what the work on scarcity shows.
Right.
The book on scarcity I'm probably going to mispronounce his name, Mullane Athen, is, I think, a good book for people to take a look at for
Yeah.
that, because a lot of convergent research showing this. I would want to connect that argument you just made, right? So what does that mean? Given our earlier thing, people are going to try and push more and more on subjective well-being, right? Because they can't get any of them, or they're getting very little. They're experiencing scarcity of meaning in life, right? And so that could potentially, I think there's an argument to be made here. More work needs to be done. So I'm pointing to an argument that I need to make, not one that I can make right now, right? But I think you can make important connections towards, the massive rise, and it's deeply affecting our political system, of narcissism as an overwhelming thing. Because if you're sort of hypersensitive and hyper vigilant and hyper oriented towards your subjective well-being, right? You want that could, I think, drive. And if you're hyper oriented towards your subjective well-being, and you sort of have an existential hole within yourself because you're not getting meaning in life, I think that helps to explain why narcissism is becoming so prevalent. I think that's important.
Right.
And we need to pay attention to that. The second thing is, I would want to make a connection to Erich Fromm's criticism of capitalism, which I do mention in this series. It ultimately goes back to the Stoics, right? Which Fromm argues that what he calls the market mentality traps us into a kind of perpetual modal confusion, in which we are trying to get needs of being and becoming, the developmental needs of meaning in life, through the having mode of control and consumption. And capitalism likes, if I can personify capitalism, to keep us in modal confusion, because if I can convince you, it's a mistake, but if I can convince you that you can become mature by buying a car, I can get you to buy my car. Or if I can convince you that you, can, be in love by having more sex, then of course I can commodify sex in a powerful way. And the thing about modal confusion, and this is Fromm's point, is it's ultimately deeply frustrating, because you're in the wrong mode, because you're in the having mode and you're trying to solve being needs, you're going to be increasingly frustrated. So it's going to interact and exacerbate with that scarcity. Because as I'm frustrated, I'm going to intensify my failing efforts to get the thing that's missing. But I'm also going to be continually failing, precisely because of the modal confusion.
That's fascinating, because that's exactly, we can go all the way back to Adam Smith. And he knew this in his book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments, that preceded his Wealth of Nations. He points out exactly this fact. He knew that we, even at that point in time, confuse capital accumulation, or confuse these kind of having modalities with our deeper need. He thought that the driving human desire was to both be seen and to feel worthy of being seen. And he very much. Yeah. And so he links that with wisdom, and he recognizes that we confuse these, but he believed that, and this is the work of Gustav Peebles, who I'll be speaking with soon, I'm excited. He believed that illusory scarcity, that kind of illusory mix-up between, let's use Fromm's language, being and having, was necessary in order to maintain society. And he wrote that if wisdom were to gain social purchase, society itself would collapse. Which was, the point that Gustav made in a paper he wrote about it was that he used that to show a fundamental difference between Smith and Marx. Whereas Smith believed we had to cling to that illusion and that mix-up, Marx wanted to kind of blow it up entirely.
Yeah. Keep going. My is, yep, keep going. Good.
So to bring that back to where we are now, I think an interesting way to bring back actually some of the work of Zach Stein. Zach has an idea that he's developed called the education commodity proposition. And the idea is that the force of commodification obviously is something that is it's a driving force in socioeconomics today. And he writes that as education has become commodified, as it becomes more of a funnel into labor markets rather than acknowledged as a human making force in society, not only is it not teaching wisdom, but that the forms of knowledge being taught are narrowing to a very particular swivel.
It's driving reciprocal narrowing.
Yes, exactly.
I agree completely. Let's just say very clearly, I agree completely with Zach on this point. I think he's
Right.
bang on about this. I think he's exactly right about this.
Yeah, and I wonder to extend that theme. He's working in education. I haven't thought a lot about this, but it seems to me that it might be fair to suggest that wisdom and the forces of commodification are not complementary vectors. That as you commodify institutional forms, it becomes more difficult for them to entertain any notion of cultivating wisdom. And so much of the project of economics that I'm exploring is this idea of whatever route you take, whatever policies you want to employ to increasingly decommodify time so that the possibilities for how we exist within that time open up, right? That's one of the ways I think about that project and these kind of coming together.
No, that's good. That's good. That goes towards Hahn's work about how the commodification that, in his book, Descent of Time, has atomized time for us. The time has and he says we can't linger with things anymore, which means we can't enter into, I would argue, we can't enter into religio. We can't couple with them. We can't enter into our participatory relationship with them because everything is atomized and buzzing rather than there being a thread of developmental lingering and duration running through it. I agree with that.
In the interest of time, we're getting close up here. That happened very quickly. There's a question that selfishly I've always wanted to ask a cognitive scientist. And so I'd like to see what this brings up for you. The notion of play, and I've heard you've spoken about play before. There's a lot of literature and study on play in children and infants and development in that sense. And there is a big strain in the kind of socioeconomic discourse of what freedom means is this kind of transition from labor into play. And so an idea that is very unclear for me is how do we think about what play is in adults, right? And how does that differ from what's occurring in children?
Well, I don't think it. I want to actually pull it apart in two. I think this is an important question. I want to sort of make a two-way distinction rather than just the distinction you made, because I think we can actually get a better understanding of what I call serious play in adults. It looks like by seeing the continuity, seeing both the continuities and the difference with child play, and we need to distinguish both child play and adult play from fun. Because one of the problems that's in our culture, this is one of the criticisms I made, is that we have reduced play to fun generation. And we've lost the fact that the word didn't have that limitation. Let me give you two, and this is meant to be cross-cultural, two clear examples. So listen to my English language, and then I'll correct it. I do Tai Chi Chuan. That's what most people would say, right? And I've been doing it for 29 years, right? But in Chinese, the verb isn't do, the verb is play.
Right.
You play Tai Chi. You don't do Tai Chi. Right. And if you think Tai Chi is about generating fun, you haven't understood Tai Chi. Tai Chi is more about generating flow. And here's the thing. Flow is very different from fun. It's an optimal experience for people, but it's not the same thing as having fun. In fact, they're very different kinds of motivational and motivational experiences. Second, right? Think another example. Think about the idea of going to a play or playing music. Those originally didn't have, they've been reduced, right? But they originally didn't have the connotation of fun generation. Instead, you were trying to do something that was inherently developmental. That's also the idea in Tai Chi Chuan, that I'm engaging in a particular kind of practice that ultimately develops me the way children develop when they're playing. And what is that? What is serious play doing for us? Well, part of what I argue is that serious play is helping us with a problem it's helping children deal with the problem. And then we have an analogous existential problem. This analogy was part of the ancient tradition, as the child is to the adult is to the sage, right? And the idea here is, so if let's say I'm a child, I'm at, let's use some of our earlier language. I'm at home in a particular, configuration of the particular agent I am in the particular world I'm living in, right? With the arena, not the not the physical environment, but that arena we were talking about earlier. So the child's in that sort of stage, right, in that world.
Mm-hmm.
The child needs to get into another world, right? The child needs to experience perspectives that it doesn't currently have, right? And
Mm-hmm.
it needs to become a self that it currently isn't. Now, how do you do that? That's a really, really hard problem, right?
Mm-hmm.
And one of the ways children do that is they play. They do play is enacted symbolism, because what a symbol does is a symbolon joined two together. It's this Janus-faced thing that points into the world you're in and out towards the world you need to get to. That's why a symbol is not just a metaphor. Metaphors are within your world. Symbols are between world. Symbols are trans world. That's why I say they transframe. They don't just reframe. Right? Now, because this has to do with perspectival and participatory development, the symbol has to be one you enact, one that you embody, right? Because it has to reach into the machinery of yourself, and it has to be how you enact your salience landscaping and perspectival knowing. You have to enact the symbol. That's play. That's serious play. That's play that is not driven by a desire for fun, but driven by a desire for development. Right? Now, of course, there's pleasure in it. I'm not trying to say that, but we've mistaken a marker of the process with the goal of the process, right? And we've mistaken something that sort of flags when it's going well with what the goal of the process is. And that, and this is an old Platonic criticism. We often mistake the criterion with the goal. That's a perennial thing we fall prey to. Human beings as adults need the same thing. And this goes to the heart of the work of, Laurie's work, L.A. Paul's work on transformative experience, and Agnes Callard's work on aspiration. We need to move between worlds. Like if I'm going to have a child, that's moving between worlds. Right. Or if I'm going to enter into seriously a long-term romantic relationship with somebody, that's moving between worlds. Or if I'm going to uproot where I am and move and go through enculturation, move to and belong to another culture, like an immigrant, that is to move between worlds. Enculturing domicile in your culture and needing to get to a world of religio and wisdom again, we need to move between worlds within the domicile of the meaning crisis. We need serious enacted analogies, enacted symbolism. We need serious play. And another way of understanding what religions are is that they are huge, communities and structures, and I mean even physical buildings that have been structured for gathering people together to collectively engage in serious play.
Wow. Yeah, maybe even to weave that final thread back in, this idea of moving between worlds is exactly, as we probably both know, what Zach Stein's focus on. His book is called Education in a Time Between Worlds, right?
Yeah, and again, Zach, more people need to pay attention to the work of Zach Stein. I think it is, for the reasons that you're putting your finger on, and we're both putting our fingers on in a convergent manner, it's very pertinent to so much of what we need to be thinking about seriously right now.
Yeah, and I would echo that for your work too, bringing not only the vocabulary but all of this energy. My favorite bits in your lectures are that when you get passionate, you're yelling, you're banging on the table, because this isn't some disembodied project for you. You can feel that this is something you're physically invested in, and it's inspiring. So I thank you for your work. I cannot wait to follow along as it carries on. And I really enjoyed this time. I appreciate that you joined me here.
Oh, thank you very much. I'm going to be carrying it on with my upcoming series on After Socrates.
Yeah,
the pursuit and cultivation of wisdom through authentic dialogue, and it's tapping into so many of the themes that we discussed today. So I'm excited about it in the way you just described. I'm passionate about it. It's a very exciting time for me.
All right. I hope you enjoyed that conversation as much as I did. It was a real blast getting to chat with John. I did want to go back a little bit to the connection when we were talking about reciprocal narrowing and capitalist realism. I I think you could tell we were both getting pretty excited about it. And this is something that I'm learning, in my role as kind of hosting these podcasts, I need to get better at. That was an area I would have liked to dwell on more, but I was so preoccupied with, what comes next and looking at some questions that I think I brought myself out of that space. So I just want to go back because I think it's really rich. John was developing the idea of reciprocal narrowing with the example of an addict, right? So the addict drinks booze, and the booze will kind of reduce the cognitive machinery he has available in order to creatively solve problems. And as that scope of creative problem solving is narrowed, right, there are fewer options that present themselves to him. The ways that he can exist in the world are narrowed. And so that booze as a central factor becomes an easier and easier choice. And so he'll drink more booze, and then more booze will further sever him from that cognitive capacity for creative problem solving. And it's this negative feedback loop that narrows in on itself. And I think there's a lot more work to be done to draw out that metaphor that is occurring in capitalism today, right? What's the machine, or what's the booze that we are engaging with structurally that is functioning to sever us from that creative problem-solving ability, all of the different cognitive machinery we have. And this was Mark Fisher's point, right? That capitalism as a socioeconomic ideology organization is such that living inside of it reciprocally narrows our imaginal capacity, our creative capacity to imagine different ways of living, different ways of organizing ourselves. And on the surface, right, if you already kind of agree with these ideas, that's going to be a really attractive notion. But can we zoom in on that attraction and see, okay, that's a nice theory, but what is the machinery, right? What are the operative forces? What are the mechanisms at play? What am I doing on a day-to-day basis that is actually reciprocally narrowing my cognition, right? How is it that by living in a way that is formulated via capitalist society, that the options that present themselves to me are diminishing and narrowing? How am I being severed from my capacity to creatively solve problems, right? And not problems in a specific sense, problems in a way that John was using, that just being a human being itself presents a problem with the abundance of information and the scarcity of your capacity to make sense of it all, right? There's always going to be an imbalance. And then the question is, if this is the case, that we are living in a particular form of capitalism that reciprocally narrows cognition, what would it mean? What would it take? And how would we think about redesigning a socioeconomic system that does just the opposite, just like John mentioned, right? What does it mean to have a socioeconomic system that engenders reciprocal expansion, reciprocal opening? What does it mean to live inside of a society that creates the conditions for people to increasingly connect with their capacity for creative problem solving, right? What are the principles of institutions, whether they're education or whether it's tax policy, whether, how we deal with provisioning some of the basics of life like healthcare and transportation and housing? What are the elements that make these such that when we interact with them, when we live with and inside of them, we are reciprocally expanded as opposed to reciprocally narrowed? And I'll leave it at that. Please, if anyone wants to join in on this discussion, has any ideas, get in touch. You can do so through the podcast website. That's musingmind.org/podcast. There are contact links and all kinds of things there. If you want to check out more of John's work, there are links on the show notes page. You can find his series on YouTube, Awakening to the Meaning Crisis. He co-wrote a book titled Zombies, a 21st Century Crisis. And he's been on a number of other podcasts. You can find him on the Future Thinkers podcast, on the Emerge podcast, on Zion 2.0, and he's done and also actually with Rebel Wisdom, he's done a lot of work with them to kind of develop the idea of what are ecologies of practice, where are they, what is already emerging, and how can we participate in that emergence. All right. Thanks for listening. I'll talk to you next time.